Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are delighted that you have joined us today for the scenario evolution process. I am Chris Ebi. I have the absolute honor of co-chairing Iconics with Bas van Rijven, who will be leading us through part of this webinar. He will talk a little bit about the shared socioeconomic pathways and how we came to today. We look forward to your questions and answers. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom to put in your questions and answers, and we will address as many of those as we can. Boz, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and welcome everyone at this webinar. It's been long ago announced that we would kick this off, and here we are to start thinking about what comes next for community scenarios. So, and as Chris said, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. You might need to look it up somewhere in the Zoom menus before you find it. But we have also a small team here behind the scenes who helps answer your questions in writing and use the Q&A also to vote up other questions so that we can see which questions are really prioritized and prioritize the answering of those. Good, with that, let's dive into the content. We are standing here on a long-standing tradition of community scenarios built over the past decades, all the way going back on the climate side to the 1990s, with scenarios developed by the IPCC, and later this being handed over from the IPCC to the research community in order to develop scenarios from originally things like the SRES, Special Report on Emission Scenarios, towards the RCPs, the representative concentration pathways, and then later the RCPs combined with SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways. So this spans a range right from being developed by international bodies like the IPCC, but also now by the research community. And also in more recent years, we've also seen other international bodies like IPBES producing also community scenarios focused more on nature than on climate. These frameworks have been around for a long time, but we want to focus here mostly now today on the shared socioeconomic pathways framework, so the one that is used for socioeconomic research. This has been, so the original goals of this framework were really to make climate change research possible across wide research communities and across different scales. The original goal was also to facilitate research that integrates climate with social futures, to more structurally think of the considerations of uncertainty, and to allow for more coherent assessments, basically, and hopefully in the end to inform policies. So it's a very wide-ranging set of goals here. On the one hand, providing a toolbox for the research community to work to stand on each other and to build on the work of each other, but also to facilitate joint scenarios that can be used for assessments and where joint insights can basically gain from. And so that's a very wide range of tasks that this framework caters to. If we think of community scenarios and what they are, if we do this basically first from the climate perspective, we have these three major communities in the climate research domain. On the one hand, the climate research community running Earth systems models. We have an impacts community looking into the impacts of climate change, and a mitigation community. And this corresponds roughly to different working groups of the IPCC. Across all of these communities, we have a different ways basically of working with and sharing scenarios. The socioeconomic scenarios about how society develops in the future sit here at the bottom, being used between the impacts community and the mitigation community, and both have traditions of developing a large number of scenarios, and you can have many different ways that the future evolves. But yeah, because society is much more flexible. If you think of the other dimension here in exchanging scenarios with the Earth systems modeling community, we'll see that there's emission scenarios being handed over basically to the heavier modeling work on the Earth systems community, and these climate change scenarios come back to the impacts community. This is a dimension where you can only handle a very limited set of scenarios because of the heavy computing needs, basically, of the Earth systems modeling community. And so the community scenarios framework covers both of these dimensions with different sets of scenarios. And this climate dimension here, we have the RCPs, the representative concentration pathways, were the original ones to cover handing over a small set of scenarios to Earth testing system modeling community. On the horizontal axis here, you have socioeconomic scenarios, and the shared socioeconomic pathways were there to enable coordination basically between these research communities and to allow analyzing both mitigation and impacts or adaptation in similar sets of future scenarios. Of course, there has been some confusion has emerged basically in the past few years, especially during CMIP 6 and the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, where the terminology of SSPs, which is fundamentally about socioeconomic futures, trickled through into the naming of scenarios basically on the climate dimension. And very colloquially, people start now using the word SSPs for emission and climate scenarios rather than for socioeconomic scenarios. But in general, the rule of thumb is if you're working only with climate data and not with other socioeconomic data like GDP or population or energy use, you're probably looking at a climate scenario rather than a socioeconomic scenario. And what we talk about here today is mostly the socioeconomic dimension. And this socioeconomic dimension exists in the SSPs, existed of 5 different foundational scenarios, basically on this axis of challenges to adaptation and challenges to mitigation. Each of these 5 scenarios existed of a narrative and a number of quantitative elements, all in such a way that it was not overly specific, but try to just distinguish the scenarios from each other and only stick to what is needed so that it can fit to a very wide use case of wide users. This was all developed about 15 years ago now. And in a paper by now already also 6 years ago, after the first scenarios forum, we raised one of these issues that was raised there with the scenarios framework, is that keeping the scenarios up to date is a challenge in itself. The need, of course, to keep narratives, the way we think about the future, the way we talk about the future, keep that up to date with societal development. That is, of course, a clear need. But there is this inherent tension between revising scenarios and frameworks and stories and providing a stable set of scenarios that can be used consistently across literature. And so it should evolve slowly and not too fast. If you look at the framework, there are different speeds naturally across the framework at which the different components evolve. So quantitative drivers, population and GDP, have been updated regularly, actually, by the population colleagues here at EASA, but also by the OECD. There have been a few updates to the original SSP updates quantifications. Also, IEM scenarios have been updated with some regularity. And then actually a real updated set also for scenario MIP is going to come out later this year still. Earth system model projections update at the speed of CMIP, IPCC cycles every 7 years. Again, there has been scenario MIP. There was a scenario MIP in CMIP 6. There is now another scenario MIP on its way in CMIP 7. And these are still based for CMIP 7 on the SSPs, providing new emission scenarios. The narratives to think about the future and the framework itself, the axes that we have, and so for these scenarios, should be much more stable. But at the same time, now we are 15 years in, and the time basically has come to really review and evolve these. And that's the process we want to introduce to you today. Because there is really a growing mandate for evolving this. First of all, of course, in thinking of the future, we are doing this in a time that the world is more or less changing under our feet. And the way we can think of the future, some futures are being sort of made much harder to achieve, if not impossible. And we are living through this rupture at the moment, as Mark Carney put it a few weeks ago. So the SSP framework was a foundational success, but was focused mostly on climate research. If we look at today's world, also the challenges that scenarios are used to cater to, that major assessments need to cater to, it's much more about the integration of climate with nature and development. And so we need a broader focus in order to actually deal with today's challenges. We have seen the development of the Nature Futures framework on the IPBES side with its own community of practice over the past years. And these two also need to relate to each other and find a way to basically be communicable. Other key shortcomings basically found by people in the community and highlighted is that doing no policy baselines or no impact baselines is increasingly artificial. We are living in a world where the impacts from climate change are happening and also where climate policies are existing or being reverted on the ground. The dealing with equity is not so explicitly or fundamentally enough to actually cater to the current needs. And also it's hard to connect the global narratives often with the regional context, and people run into limitations of the framework there, and those are issues that need to be tackled and taken on. And so it's time to start thinking about this under a process we have labeled the scenario evolution process. And this has the ambition to evolve this community scenario framework into a more up-to-date framework that's more holistic, looking at climate, nature, and development, that's more solution-oriented, still fit for both research, for assessments, and for user-facing applications. And to analyze equitable, sustainable development under diverse perspectives of worldviews and narratives. And the way we want to go into this process is do this very inclusively and transparently, and coordinated, initiated by ICONICS, the International Committee on New Climate Change Assessment Scenarios. That was established during the development of the initial SSP framework to oversee its development, and now taking on this mandate basically to oversee also a process to evolve it further. And we really want to do this with as much inclusion and diversity here as possible, and participation across as many disciplines to reach out across to many other scientific and user communities. So for this, we have developed basically since early summer last year, discussed and developed a process of what this can look like. And today is about telling you what this process is and how you can engage with it. If we look at the big picture on the timeline, if we look about 10 years ahead, and the major global assessments and products that this framework caters to, we see that we have in the next few years, there's the IPCC 7th assessment report is being written. IPBES on the biodiversity side has its General Assembly. And in 2030, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are due. And so we're living also into this post-SDG period here. And in principle, in 2035, around that time, we should expect an 8th assessment report for the IPCC that is based on literature that should have emerged by then. If we look at the big research activities related to these assessments, there is at the moment currently CMIP 7 with its scenario MIP is happening. ECMIP, the impact assessment model into comparison project, is happening with its and in connection with that. On the side of IPBES, there is also other processes like bending the curve 2 happening at the moment as well, and based on existing frameworks and scenarios. Oh, and I see actually, sorry, IPBES GA2 is a global assessment, not a general assembly. Then if we look at after 2030, we'll expect at some point a CMIP 8 and an IPBES continuation as well. So if you look at this timeline, there is now a time window basically in the next about 5 years to say we will evolve and study how to evolve this framework. The existing framework with the SSPs remains having its relevance basically for the current ongoing assessment, but we should now start thinking about what comes afterwards in order to have something ready by the time that we need it in the 2030s. And so the process that we have designed for this consists of 3 main phases. We'll start with the first phase of community input, where we'll collect your views, proposals for how things can be done differently, and especially ideas of how to do things better in a new framework. And we'll go into the details of that. And this should basically end or culminate into an expert workshop in the first half of 2027 to go into a scenario framework design phase, where out of that, the expectation is out of the expert workshop, there will come a proposal for what a new scenario framework can look like, and then go into steps of regional and global community review. This phase should wrap up late in 2028 and partly overlap with a next step to actually go into quantitative scenario design and think more quantitatively of these scenarios. Also, again, both global and regional, and have in mind what needs to be, what can be improved. A lot of this, also what the exact shape it will get, still depends on funding that we might be able to secure or not. At this point, the first phase, we can go in without explicit funding, but a lot of these, real meetings that need to happen later in this process, it all that, depends on funding. For the community input phase, so this first phase of this project over the next 1.5 years, more or less, we have identified 3 main pillars to build this around. One is a survey that will be introduced to you in a few minutes. A second pillar is a academic paper collection to collect your ideas and thought through proposals basically for what an improved scenario framework can look like. And a pillar around workshops and conference sessions to discuss ideas and spread the word on the fact that this is happening. And all of these pillars should feed into the expert workshop where things come together for proposing the way forward. And so with that, I would want to hand over to my other iconics and support members here that we have, the people who run this process, to talk you also through each of these 3 pillars, and then we'll get back to wrapping it up. So handing over to Jonathan Moyer now to show the survey and website.
Okay, greetings from sunny Denver, Colorado, at the University of Denver and the Party Institute. You should see a website on your screen, and that is the home of this SEP process. So the URL is at the top. You can also just type in sep.du.edu, and this has the resources that we're going to kind of frequently update related to this first community engagement phase. From Boss's slides, there were three main pillars of this. One is a survey. The top of the site, you can see that here. Another is academic publications, that lives here. And a third is workshops. We also have this fourth FAQ page. We'll synthesize some of the questions in the chat, and also we'll be wanting to understand from the community what major questions there are. So first, this is our first cut at the logo. We're curious to know if you have any thoughts about that. It's trying to capture the idea that we're trying to understand what these balances between these big systems might look like. On the main page of the process, we describe the process. We provide news and updates. So right now, this is where you would be able to find information on this video or slides from this talk. We're providing the timeline, also looking at kind of an overview of the process, who's coordinating this activity, and then a bit of that history of scenarios. So we're trying to provide a broad-based resource here. On the survey itself, the survey is one of the key pillars. What we really want to come out of this conversation is lots of people taking this survey and also sharing this survey really widely with a broad set of stakeholders in this process. The structure of the survey is kind of choose your own adventure. Most of the questions are not mandatory, but there are really three broad tracks. One is for a new audience track where we're gathering really general feedback on climate or these broader kind of scenarios and what people might be interested in seeing. Another is what we're calling a kind of consumer track, which these are people who are consuming SSP-oriented narrative and quantitative research. And then a third track of experts, people who are working more on the development. And it takes about 15 minutes for an expert to go through if they're filling everything out carefully. The survey itself is done in Qualtrics and should be fairly straightforward. If you have any questions about that, you can email me or we have an email address for this process itself. That is sep@du.edu. So that email will also go to me, but choose your own adventure in that way. The publication space, this is describing initially our goals here, but I think Vanessa will talk in more detail after me. And then the workshop space is also a bit thin as we start to figure out what this more broadly looks like. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions, and you will receive an email that asks you to take the survey. But in addition to that, we're going to really ask you to share this widely. Share this with students, share this with policymakers you engage with, share this with other academics who can't be here. The more information we can get at the front end of this process, the more we believe that we can really understand the degree to which we need to evolve the SSP framework into something different. Is it a small evolution or a big evolution? That's one of the key questions I have in mind here. So with that, I don't have anything else to present. I think it's all straightforward, and we'll be in the Q&A if you have any questions.
So that's indeed the website where you can find also the survey. You should be able to see my screen again. Yes, so now I hand over to Vanessa Schweitzer to inform you more about the academic paper process that we have in mind.
Okay, thank you, boss. So I am calling in from snowy Canada. I am in the Kitchener-Waterloo region. I work at the University of Waterloo. And in terms of trying to coordinate the academic papers pillar, basically what we're trying to do with this paper collection is create a forum. And I know we're trying to reach out with you all right now, verbally trying to like establish this forum, but in terms of having people actually write down exactly what they would say the scenarios framework needs to do as we're moving forward in 2026 right now. That's where we want to collect your thoughts about how might this framework be structured in such a way that it achieves some of the goals that Boss mentioned earlier in this presentation. So that's where we really want to tap into people's desires and wishes for what an evolved framework ought to be doing. And I have that image there on the screen, which is showing a visual picture of how in fields like landscape architecture, for example, people recognize that a designer might have a vision for what they think is a good way to establish something. And then people actually try to use what the designer created, and then they reveal what they really wished it would do. So we're hoping that by having this paper collection process, we want to try to collect as much as possible people's desires of what they would want the evolved framework to be doing for the kinds of alternative futures that we're facing now. So, bearing in mind that that's really what's motivating having this paper collection, I do want to briefly comment on ways that we really want to open up the discussion. So, although Boss and others who are part of Iconics and who have been active in the scenarios community see that it would be nice perhaps to figure out a way to have a holistic approach to the fact that we have all kinds of challenges that are interdependent now. Some people might be able to articulate a vision where all of these things very clearly come together under one umbrella. Others instead might say, no, it's fine that we have kind of like different approaches to scenarios that are bubbling up. We need to figure out how to weave them together. And then yet others, I thought I saw a comment in the Q&A box saying that like, actually, some of these user communities are really different. And maybe it makes sense that people clearly have lanes that they stay in, perhaps, right? This is an example of like the diversity of ways that people perhaps might respond to this kind of call. Once again, just kind of reminding folks about what it is that we think the framework ideally ought to be doing. We want to be supporting a variety of ways that people engage with the framework. They might be using it for research or using it for scientific assessments, such as IPCC processes or IPBES processes. But then also there are all kinds of folks who are trying to plug into the framework, and they're trying to offer decision support at a local level. So how can we have a framework or some sort of guiding principles that help people sort of see how they fit into this wider community where we're all trying to build on each other's work? Also, we want to hear from folks their ideas about how we can ensure that the framework invites more contributions from diverse perspectives. There is a recognition that under the existing frameworks, you see a lot of contributions being made by the Global North, for example. So one of the open questions is, are there things about the current design that are leading to that kind of outcome? And so are there ways that we can reimagine a framework that might actually support and make it more visible where there are alternative ways of thinking about these futures, but we're all able to sort of see each other and learn from each other. And then, of course, this is not an exhaustive list. So there might be other needs that folks have in mind. And then absolutely, we are, encouraging people to put those thoughts down in written form. So that way we can have sort of this written forum where we are understanding more deeply each other's ideas and then having engagement over that. So next slide, please. So in terms of what this process that we are envisioning and we're moving forward on in terms of how to collect all of these thoughts, we are working on putting together a virtual special issue. And I guess I say virtual in parentheses because we imagine that would be the most flexible way to get people where some people maybe have already been thinking about this for a while and they are ready to, open the call. I've got a manuscript. I'm going to submit it. Others might need some time to talk with co-authors or even just, put their own ideas down. And so that's where the timing for who's ready to submit what might be different. And so that's where we also wanted like a flexible approach where as the papers come in, perhaps we would be following a virtual special issue model where for journals that do that, that's where like they publish papers as they are mature and as they're ready to be published. And then we don't all have to wait for the same special issue to be published at the same time. Also, the nature of what we want people to be sharing with us. We're really looking for developed ideas. So I have here on the images, I've got some like fully baked loaves of bread to contrast with kind of half-baked ideas, where sometimes if people only have 3,000 words, maybe the idea is not fully fleshed out. So we're really encouraging people to elaborate, right, on exactly how might an evolved framework what would that look like? What are the limitations that it would overcome? So we're really looking for those, longer pieces that show fully developed ideas. Also, we are proposing that the manuscripts, when they are submitted for peer review, that they are also submitted for a pre-publication server such as SSRN. That way, we can actually have community members who are not just the peer reviewers seeing each other's proposals and actually commenting on the preprints. So that will actually like enrich the review process because then the authors are going to get feedback from the peer reviewers, but then also they can get feedback from fellow peers who are just reading the manuscript and commenting right on a preprint server. So there is a proposed timeline here, just as Boss was saying in his remarks. We can see that even though it might seem like 2035 is way out there, when you actually break down all of the steps of what it is that you're trying to do, we have to get started now. And so we do have this proposal under consideration with the journal. Unfortunately, the timing of when we wanted to kick this off and when the journal could tell us whether or not they are completely ready to host us didn't quite line up. But this is basically what we're proposing. So the actual call for papers we envision would open very soon, such as March or April. And then we were proposing again having about a 6-month window for people to work on those papers after they see the more detailed call for proposals, where it will be built on what you've been seeing in this presentation today. And then that's where like the first round of review, we think that can turn around in about 2 to 3 months. And then we're aiming for actually having the revised papers ready in time for one of those first expert workshops in early 2027 to start discussing the framework evolution based on what we're seeing from the survey, for example, also what we're seeing for people submitting to this academic paper process. So that's basically what is being proposed. And as Jonathan was showing on the website, updates as they happen. We will put all of this information on the website as well. And so that's where once we have confirmed which journal is going to be hosting the call for papers, all of that information will be posted so that way people can engage right away. And that's it, Boss, for me.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa, for talking us through that. And if people have any questions on this, also put it please in the Q&A box and also there vote on the questions that you would prefer to see answered. We have one more pillar to go through here, and that's on workshops and conference sessions. And for that, I'm handing over to my colleagues Inga Menke and then Alex de Chabinen afterwards.
Thanks, Bas. Yeah, I'm Inga Menke. I'm based at JASE in Austria, and I'm a stakeholder engagement expert. And I will talk you a little bit through what we have planned, not only in the first phase, but in general, what we are kind of seeing in the whole process for engagement, both online and in person. Starting with phase 1, we are here in the kickoff webinar. Which is a global activity. We are adding some other Q&A sessions to this webinar so that we ensure people from different time zones can also comment on what we're presenting here. And that's kind of the start of this phase. The next big thing is, of course, launching the survey where we want the community to provide input, but we are also looking into other opportunities for the community to meet. As Bart already pointed out, at the moment we don't have funding, so we are looking for opportunities that arise from existing conferences or workshops. And ETU, for example, is one of these opportunities. We will have a splinter meeting there. So if you're attending ETU, then please look for it. That will be an opportunity to also discuss in person. EGU takes place in May in Vienna in 2026. We also are looking into a scenario experience workshop for end of 2026. Alex will say more about it, so I'm not going to dive deeper into this now here. But basically, we are using the information we are getting in this first phase in the community to bring it to the expert workshop, which is planned for the first half of 2027, this expert workshop. So there will be information also probably on the website, how you can participate in this workshop. And the aim is to kick off the second phase in this workshop. It will not be the only opportunity, also because we are aware we can't have a massive workshop, and travel restrictions may also apply. So we want to make sure that communities in different regions also have opportunities. So workshops should also be focused on different regions. And this whole process will likely take a year and a half, maybe a little bit longer, and will be concluded by another expert workshop. If I can have the next pic, yeah. We are still looking for ideas for regional workshops. So if you have any ideas, it would be great if you can reach out. On my next slide, I will also share how. And I just want to emphasize what Bart has already said. This whole phase depends on funding. So how many in-person interactions we can have really, yeah, will depend on what opportunities we find. And if that falls through, we also can you go back? Sorry, if that falls through, we will also look into online participation. Lastly, in the third phase, we are also looking for further engagement opportunities. We haven't mapped this out because we are now talking a long time into the future. But for example, the Scenarios Forum 2029 will be such an opportunity, which is also an opportunity to validate already initial results, but also kind of a fine-tuning of this qualitative scenario design phase. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. What we are aiming to do with this workshop and conference sessions is to ensure that we have an inclusive process where we both look at international but also at the regional level and engagement across different communities. So we want diverse engagement both geographically but also across sectors. As said, we are looking for funding. If you have amazing ideas, please just email us to the sep@du.edu. And the same goes for international conferences. If you know of any conferences taking place next year, or also later, but in regions or also this year, please email us. We may not be aware of key conferences that we should have in sight, but where we should potentially be present. Just quick summary, phase one, we are starting now. There are plenty of opportunities for engagement. I've seen many of you already posting interesting comments in the Q&A. We really encourage you to fill in the survey and also engage in the upcoming meetings. We will make sure to inform about whatever is planned. And then a big thing to look out for is really the expert workshop at the beginning of phase two. Then I would like to hand over to Alex so that you can take us a bit more through the upcoming or the planned workshop.
Thank you, Inga. My name is Alex Desherbinen. I'm a director of CESN, a center at the Columbia Climate School. CESN stands for Center for Integrated Earth System Information, and a member of the steering committee of Iconics. Greetings from sunny New York City, where we're still digging out from a snowfall that occurred 2.5 weeks ago. You know, many of you are aware that the idea of scenario development didn't originate with Iconics or the SSP process, or for that matter, the IPCC, but goes back to things like the World 3 model that the Club of Rome developed as part of its Limits to Growth publication. Shell Oil developed foresight units back in the 70s and continues to fund those kinds of units, that unit, and there's many other businesses that have foresight units. And of course, Barry Hughes in the 1980s established a research group known as the International Futures Group at University of Denver, which Jonathan Moyer is now part of. So this long history and tradition is something that we believe we can build on. And of course, those are not the only groups that use future scenarios. There's been groups like the World Bank and UN Population Division and others that have been peering into the future using various methodologies and techniques specific to their disciplines. We feel that the scenario evolution process can really benefit from learning from these other efforts. And so we have put in a proposal with the Aspen Global Change Institute, and we're in conversation with them. But if it doesn't work out to work with them, we may choose another venue. But we would like to bring together groups such as the Party Institute for International Futures, which I mentioned earlier at the University of Denver, the UN POP Division, the Integrated Assessment Consortium, Modeling Consortium, IPBES, other experts such as in areas of AI and technology development, experts in the development of regional and sectoral scenarios, and groups from the Global South that may be involved in developing scenarios related to the SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, groups like ICIMIP, the Intersectoral Impact Model into Comparison Project, which has a rich experience in scenario development. So we want to bring these diverse groups together to explore and exchange experiences. And basically, if the goal of the scenario evolution process is to expand beyond climate change, we feel that there could be a lot of benefits from cross-fertilization with these other groups. What I would like to invite you to do is there's an email, which I think has already been circulated. It's sep@du.edu. So scenario evolution process at denveruniversity.edu, sep@du.edu. And if you have suggestions and in fact would like to be involved in this process, then we welcome you. And if you can recommend other groups that we might have missed in our list of potential partners, we really love to hear from you. So I will close there. Thank you. And Boss, over to you, since I think you're
Yes, indeed. That doesn't all go as fast as it should. Thanks, Alex and Inga, for talking through that pillar and how we think about meeting and in-person communication that we can do. So how can you engage with this? As we just discussed, there's these three main pillars that we start this off with, that we have identified to kick things off with. That's the user survey, the academic paper collection, and workshops and conference session. But if you're up to organizing other ways of organizing and harvesting community input, please let us know, because we are very open. This needs to be a community carried process of how we evolve this scenario framework. If you have ideas, some of you online might be related to funders. If you have ideas to help secure funding, reach out to us and we will reach out to some of you as well. Another way of contributing is through in-kind contributions through research. That's one example of what you've just seen, is the survey that Jonathan put together and is collecting, because that's of course also a research project in itself. And many of you might have research projects and ideas ongoing, which you think might actually fit well with this process. And we are very open to your suggestions. In terms of very concrete next steps, we have this webinar was scheduled on a not so Asia or Eastern Hemisphere friendly time. This recording will be posted soon on the SEP website, and we have scheduled 2 Q&A sessions early March to discuss further what kind of issues people might have come up with. One on the Monday, the 2nd of March, at an early European morning for the Eastern Hemisphere, and one on the 5th of March at later in the day on the European side for the Western Hemisphere. Those are the most direct next steps here. Otherwise, keep an eye on the website. It's in development, and any questions, email them to this sep@du.edu email address. To reiterate, maybe what we start here is really for the long term, and what we've tried throughout this is to avoid predicting what this framework might end up with. When every time we start these discussions, there's potentially very wild ideas added to the table immediately, and so it can very well be that this process evolves in a direction that is unanticipated at this point, and if we come up with ideas of a future framework that we don't foresee yet. And so that also makes the process has to be adaptive to that if we come up after this community engagement phase to collect your ideas, if at the expert workshop and the proposals we go in a direction that doesn't really fit with how we have now sketched out phase 2 and 3, we will have to adapt to make that work. With that, it's now time to start answering questions that you might have. Put those in the Q&A box, please. And also there, if you see questions that you'd like to be answered, vote those up, because then we know which questions to prioritize. We prefer to prioritize here those are questions mostly on the process and what the process is going to be. The content of ideas for what things could look like, really please start thinking about that and start writing things down and formalizing things to collect that in that special issue in the literature, but also other thoughts, bring them to the surface so that we can collect them really in a more structured way and can see the opinions on across the community. With that, let me stop here the sharing on the screen and go over to a more open Q&A session and invite a few people who want to answer some of these questions here, and looking at my colleague Chris, whether there were already sort of questions identified to start with answering here.
Thank you, Boz, and congratulations, everyone, for really excellent presentations. I would like to take some of the questions that were posted and synthesize and turn it into a different question. So there's questions here that are very much about scale, concerns about using scenarios for short term versus using scenarios for the long term, that scenarios historically were designed and implemented looking across the century and now looking past the end of this century. And there's several questions that are asking about short-term discontinuities. Brian O'Neill answered that in a COVID box in his paper, looking at the extent to which a short-term discontinuity like COVID could affect some of the longer-term trends. And the overall answer was probably not. But as many people pointed out in the chat, there are now some short-term discontinuities. Someone noted that within a very brief period of time, President Trump's going to void the endangerment finding in the US and thereby voiding all bases for all policies, programs, et cetera, for regulating greenhouse gases in the US, which could potentially have long-term consequences. And as you can hear, I'm rambling, but it is a fundamental tension that we're quite aware of. And we really do want to hear from people in the survey, because it is about the questions around The focus for the scenarios, we're not committed to the axes that currently exist, and how to evolve current scenarios so that they can be used to look at these discontinuities to better understand long-term consequences. I would love to hear from the other panel members on that point. Boz, did you want to add to that? Or Vanessa or Jonathan?
I think it's the kind of question that we're trying to learn more about through the survey, with how many people view these discontinuities as really key factors that must be included in a future kind of scenario space. I agree that I think it's a very nice synthesis, Chris, of some of the questions and comments in here. There's also the question about the long term. How much further should we be producing SSPs? And we have a preprint, not to be too self-promoting, but we have a preprint that's pushing the SSPs to 2150 on the quantification side. And we really struggled with how to think about the world with all these short-term disruptions and what that extreme long-term could look like on the socio development side. So I'm really excited to see what the community thinks about what we need to do. There are also, if I could, a number of comments and questions about what we mean by community, and is this kind of a top-down process, or how do we balance that work? I think if both of you could speak to that, that would be really valuable. I'll give my perspective as one person. I'm not on the Iconic steering committee. I've been a user and developer on the quantification side of the SSPs, and I have to say that I think the process is meant to be as inclusive as possible. And so we want to know if you're listening to this and you really want to be involved and you have strong views, like that's what the survey is meant to identify. And so I think I'm trying to point everyone to that survey and that website and have them share that as widely as possible. And that's how I view the community-driven process, but over to others on the committee as well.
And I'm happy to do a little bit of history to help explain, I hope. At the end of the special report on emission scenarios, for very valid reasons, it was decided that the IPCC would no longer be engaged in developing scenarios. Instead, it's up to the community. And then suddenly it was the beginning of the fifth assessment cycle, and not much had been done. And recognizing that just leaving it to the broad range of potential users, people who are interested in the whole scenario process in using the scenarios, that there does need to be someone who helps push forward on reaching out to the community, to getting the opinions of the community, to have as broad engagement as possible, which is what we're trying to do today. That if this wasn't started now, there would continue to be discussions for several years to come of the SSPs have been useful for this, but they're no longer useful for that because information has changed. It just takes somebody to catalyze the process. So in the broadest terms, the community is anybody who's interested or who could potentially use whatever the shared socioeconomic pathways will evolve into. We're just trying to move the process along. We being the royal we, with Boz leading the effort. Boz?
Yeah, now maybe a brief reflection also on the use of community here, and then I see Vanessa who can also chime in. Because indeed, so this as you mentioned, Chris, after the IPCC asked the community basically to develop scenarios, the first question that emerged around 2010 was actually, who is the community? And the community needed to find out who they were and organize itself. In the whole process of doing so, we find that these scenarios serve a few purposes across the community. And a very important one is this toolbox aspect, that it the socioeconomic scenarios, SSPs, have been sort of defined to the minimum needed and allowing many individual studies actually then to interpret them for their fields, for the aspects that they are interested in. And we are still doing that. Actually, we are at the moment still expanding, for example, the SSPs in the direction of health, because that is still very important to bring scenarios thinking in that direction. A lot of those efforts brought scenario thinking into other communities in general, into other disciplines. And now we can build upon that basically and take it with this broader growing community of disciplines and expertise actually into a next phase and have much wider participation because there's been more people involved into this work over the longer time. The other advantage that this has is that the other advantage of this toolbox aspect is that you don't have to start from Adam and Eve yourself if you're a researcher and you want to do scenarios work. You can pick from the literature what has been developed that is at least qualitatively consistent with the types of scenarios that you might be looking at, and then interpret and use those other quantifications or other interpretations of scenarios for certain regions or cities that are that you don't have to develop yourself then on the ground. And so this function basically creates on the ground a community that works with these scenarios. The thing at the same time on the IPBES side, there's also been sort of this community of practice that's been established also with many hundreds of people being involved there, working with the Nature Futures framework. And it's a similar kind of dynamic, just because you have some shared scenarios across a wide range of across a wide community, you can all stand on each other's shoulders. And that's what we want to also emphasize, hopefully, with the next new framework. Now over to Vanessa.
Yeah, thanks, Boss. And so my comments are building on what's been asked or said so far, but then there was also a question in the Q&A from Mavra regarding SSPs presented as academic products, right? Because I was talking about the academic pillar and how I feel like Mavra's question is related to what folks have been saying so far is that originally, I guess, when the SSPs were developed in that particular framework, as Boss mentioned, people hoped that things were sufficiently transparent, that people were like seeing the basic SSPs as points of inspiration for their own work. But that's not necessarily how it fell on everybody's ears, because some people did jump in and start playing with them and adapting them to their own use cases. But then other people perceive barriers, being like, these SSPs are from, this group of researchers who are setting an agenda about how we're supposed to be thinking about the future. And so I guess one of the things that perhaps we could consider with respect to the scenario evolution process that we have described so far, and also, are there other ways that we can package or design the way that we talk about this framework or the way that we talk about different communities engaging with each other so that people who are more coming from like the creative arts, they can actually see that the work that they are doing and the ways that they are thinking about the future can actually be aligned with how there are some other communities, right, such as an integrated assessment modeling community, right? Like, how is it that integrated assessment modelers, they have a certain approach to how they try to explore the future, and then a creative artist has a different approach. But is there a way that someone could look at both of these things and see that they are somehow enhancing each other? So that's sort of the question. Is it possible to put together a framework or to put together, Boss, you mentioned community of practice, right? Is Is it maybe the way that the community talks about itself and how we ought to engage? Is it maybe a more of a procedure thing that needs to be evolved, right? So these are sort of the open questions that we would like to hear back from people where if you have only 15 minutes, right? Express your thoughts in that 15-minute survey that Jonathan said, because we will see it and then we'll be able to integrate it into this process. But then alternatively, if you have something that you could write and explain and say, these are the barriers with the current way that the SSP framework exists. And here's my vision of like how we could take those barriers down and have that in written form. And then maybe that's where the academic pillar is the way that you plug in. But I hope that helps to clarify what we're trying to do with this process.
And if I could do a two-finger intervention on that in terms of engagement particularly from art, if you have the opportunity, I suggest looking at what was done in Finland for their national scenarios. And they have incredibly creative visions of the shared socioeconomic pathways for two particular places in Finland. And they're a real significant addition to helping people understand how to think about the future, what the future could look like. And these were all based on community input. So yes, absolutely, we would like that kind of engagement. Boz, I think you were going to speak.
Yes, no, one of the things I'm also toying in the back of my mind with, and one of that could be a contribution to this process, could be indeed have an artist panel actually work with us across these next few years. Definitely also people like writers who can basically envision futures in ways that we as scientists are not necessarily so good at, or not trained for. There was a question that now also has been answered in writing, but on inclusivity and how we make sure that, indeed, we have the participation that we want to have. Inga, would you want to have a first go at answering that?
Yes, I can maybe come back to this. As already mentioned, yes, we currently do not have confirmed funding, but this is exactly why we are talking, or like already talking about what we want to do at this stage. Our intention is absolutely not to have exclusive workshops. Our priority will be to ensure that we find funding, particularly for travel from the Global South, but also to ensure this is why we want to have regional events, and we are looking already into opportunities. For example, we are already planning for 2027 to definitely have something take place in Asia, where probably the Scenarios Forum will take place. So we are definitely wanting to ensure that events take place in different regions and that we can ensure participation from different communities. Maybe also to highlight, if we do not get funding, we will have conversations on how to ensure an online participation process to make sure we actually capture voices from around the world, and we do not exclude a community. Any kind of input at this point is also very welcome. So if you have specific ideas of what we could do to make the process more inclusive or better, please let us know, because I mean, we are presenting this here in a somewhat raw format so that we can ensure we take all of your input on board and move forward from here. Bas, please complement.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think that actually summarizes it well. Maybe one example of the regionality, we have the Scenarios Forum series. We had, of course, the first one in 2019 was in Denver. We've had then 2 in Europe, and the next one for 2027 is on the roll to take place in Korea later in 2027. And so we try to rotate around the world also to make it lower the barrier of participation in these in person. Looking at questions, there's not much showing up anymore in the Q&A, but I see Alex showing up with a camera on.
Yeah, Bas, this didn't really come up in the Q&A. And by the way, I've been fascinated to read the many responses that have been provided there in the questions. I guess one thing I just thought might be good to bring up in this context is the potential risk of trying to become all things to all people. And the basic premise of the SSPs, if even if you took away just the climate framing of mitigation versus adaptation, at least had a sort of socio-ecological nexus. And I think that we try to convey that in the website with the yin yang sort of symbol that we developed. But if you start bringing in political disruptions, such as the type that Tom Paris has mentioned in his Q&A, things that occur on kind of discontinuities that occur, these social trends and cultural patterns that are emerging in some ways, resistance to the neoliberal order and the Washington Consensus, and concerns about liberal democracy sort of faltering. I'm just wondering how we still keep the focus on the socio-ecological system, and I'm sure other panelists have thought much more about this. But what are the risks of becoming too broad?
So that is a risk, and that is to be discussed and in how we can do that. I think the thinking of how we can do things better or be broad but yet specific, the thinking of that is exactly what we would want to invite with the special issue, basically, right? This webinar is like a first a kickoff to say, hey, start thinking about these things and help your colleagues and community further, so that we can jointly design something that works better than it does at the moment. Alex, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on this. This is the other Alex. I'm Alex Ruane at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. I'm going to take what Alex said and maybe link it with some other questions that we were answering in the chat and Q&A about kind of the way that we can operate along the existing scenarios. So, for example, a lot of times the ESMs are running a benchmark version of an SSP RCP kind of combination, but we know that there's room within the narratives for other specific quantifications that are possible. And likewise, we've done a lot of thinking in Iconics about how we elaborate on these scenarios and create spaces to go further into regional scenarios, to go further into sectoral scenarios and system scenarios. This is another area that we think is an important place to receive some feedback from the various communities. Knowing that more and more people are engaging in this area also means we're getting questions from these types of users and developers. So I think it's important for us to consider whether the scenario is providing enough detail to distinguish the scenarios, to create the overall frame in which regional and sectoral kind of activities are happening. There's a whole other set of science, a whole other set of data, a whole other set of challenges as we do that. But this is another part of the evolution process that will go a long way. And it links with what we found in other places, such as Scenario Map, that there really is, these scenarios are not trying to predict a specific future. They're trying to understand kind of the conditions on which we would then add impacts, on which we would then add additional stochastic behaviors and other things like that, that could give us an idea of what the future portends. Thanks.
Thank you. That's indeed very helpful, thoughtful contribution there. a bit overwhelmed here with the amount of questions and what to do and point to people. Here, Chris, do you have something ready to go?
I've been trying to figure out how, as a panelist, I can put into the Q&A the link to the Finscapes. If anybody knows how to do that.
I think your proposal in the panelist chat to just include that in the email that we will send afterwards might be the easiest
Chris,
one.
the other option would be to have somebody just ask for the Finscapes, and then you can reply with the thing. So if anybody wants to do that without 1,000 of you, please, that'd be helpful. While I have the microphone, boss, I'll just also note, I think you may have said this earlier, but we are hosting several of these webinars in the coming weeks. So some of you may have noticed that the participation reflects the time zones here a little bit, but rest assured we have taken effort to make sure that other people can get their voices and also hear what our plans are, and that process will continue to roll out. Also, good opportunity if you have colleagues who would have been interested in this webinar and couldn't make it today, there will be more. Thanks.
Yes, thanks a lot, Alex, for that pitch. Let me pick up one question here that's put forward by Roberto Valdivia on the importance indeed of the inclusivity and that this is without funding simply really hard, not only for travel and participation in meetings, but also for doing the work. And that's indeed well acknowledged also on the side of those who have now kicked off this process. Is that without sort of indeed substantial backing from funding agencies, in the end, it's going to be really hard for people to really contribute content-wise substantially to these developments, and that will keep cementing in a global north bias of where at least people used to have more spare capacity to actually contribute to these processes. We are well aware. Be really, really open. Welcome to suggestions on how to help solve this in a way that's also still manageable, of course, and overseeable. But it's definitely a very, very important point, and that's why we've. So not all of this is set in stone for the next 5 years, or not. Actually, very little is set in stone for the next 5 years. At the same time, we need to kick this off at some point, right? So it's not perfect and perfectly thought through all the way to the end, but we need to. The things that we can start now of collecting your views, collecting ideas, are things that we hope we can do in the next 1.5 years without much funding. But also, we need to use the next 1.5 years to actually secure that funding for the later phases in this process.
And Boz, if I could add to that, there's several parts to this. One is the inclusivity in the meetings themselves, which funding is going to be critical to make that happen. But the other is this process will kick off a whole range of research. And we certainly encourage everybody on this call, everybody in the community, to be inclusive in your research as well, because that will ultimately feed back to the process as people start writing papers, people start thinking about analyses that can be conducted, that there should be an emphasis from all of us and emphasis when we talk with the funders about that inclusivity.
Indeed. And now looking at, I'm not sure, I think we are here well running for a nice duration. There's not so many questions coming in anymore. I would want to, of course, point you to the fact how we will follow up from this. We will post this recording on the website so that everyone can see it. Also, those for whose time zones this was not so great. And then on the 2nd and on the 5th of March, we organized 2 follow-up Q&A sessions to discuss more any questions that might have arisen, and maybe also go deeper in some of the questions that we tried to answer on the spot today, but might have a better answer to in a few weeks. Let me, while having a look at these final questions that come in, also solicit whether anyone here that's on the panelist side, which is the whole Iconic Steering Committee, actually has any final thoughts or reflections that they would want to share. And then in order to do that, please just come on camera so that people can see you.
I have a quick question to the participants. If you ask, we can post on the Q&A the links for the upcoming Q&A sessions, because we can't post to that, but if you ask for it, we can post to that. And Jonathan can repost the email address if people have further thoughts after this. But mostly, we really want to thank everybody for your thoughtful engagement, all the questions you raised, and really look forward to working very closely with all of you and to broaden our community as we move forward.
The website is SEP, Scenario Evolution Process, sep.du, denveruniversity.edu. And the email address is sep@du.edu.
Great.
Indeed. For the last few seconds, we can just share that so that you can see that. Okay. Thanks. With that, I think we leave it at this, and any other remaining questions we'll pick up in the Q&A sessions early March. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.